Alright, so in the Sonic the Hedgehog comic series, there's really sort of two main themes of the world building that get fleshed out in the first about 100 issues of the series, and those are really foundational. And between the two of them, there is the Knuckles backstory and the Sonic backstory. Those are kind of the two halves. And the Knuckles backstory is really the one that gets fleshed out first. And I think that might have been because Knuckles was not actually present as a character in the Saturday morning cartoon that the comic was primarily based off of. So there was a really open space there for the writers. Ken Penders in particular, he's a sort of a divisive character in the story of the creation of the comics. But he's really the one who kind of takes the lead initially with building this universe beyond the ideas that are sort of clearly obvious from the games, or maybe not so obvious, and those that are sort of really explicit in the cartoon. So Knuckles as a character is really sort of, you know, the Sasuke to Sonic's Naruto, to use a much later sort of similar story, sort of for a similar audience. Knuckles' backstory has a lot to do with lineage. It has a lot to do with patrilineal duty between father to son. It's affecting, and it's really sort of building this direction that the series eventually tries to take for a long time, of moving Sonic into a more classic storytelling territory. It's moving out of the sort of, you know, in-your-face attitude ideas of the marketing and into a much more, you know, classically Western sort of storytelling structure. So with Knuckles' backstory, we have an ancient sort of evil character in Dimitri, who renames himself Enerjack after he absorbs the Chaos Emerald power that the ancient, technologically advanced Echidna society uses to raise their city as a floating island into the sky after there's a meteor disaster that threatens to destroy their civilization. But as the comic goes on, even that is revealed to ultimately be just a portion of the history of Echidna society. And what we see is really interesting, especially towards the later half of the first 100 issues, is this idea that is incorporated from the later Dreamcast games of Echidna society having this sort of ancient tribal component. And this ends up tying back, I think, into some of the ideas that are present visually in some of the Genesis games. But what I find so interesting about looking at this first 100 issues, as formative as they are, and these ideas about the Echidna Society's relationship with technology, and how first they have a very strong relationship with technology, and how they eventually reject that relationship with technology, and how there then is conflict over that, and sort of an interesting geopolitical idea of what of territory dispute between them and the Dingoes, the Dingo Society, the militaristic Dingo Society, and you can read some very curious racial parallels to that with some other things and other ideas. But what's interesting to me is that while there is a lot of lore, the emotions of the story don't really become sort of recognizably and believably sort of human, sort of a more modern and maybe postmodern literature, until Ian Flynn ends up taking over as the main writer of the comic much later. One of the things about Knuckles and Sonic as well is that, and many of the characters, is that as great of writers as Carl Bohlers and Ken Penders were of sort of world building and creating plots and creating these ideas, one of their weaknesses was many of their characters and their interpretations of the characters struggled to be alive behind the eyes, struggled to be, sort of feeling and expressive, personalities, behind just their actions. And when Ian Flynn ends up taking over, especially with the Knuckles issues in the later Sonic Universe series, this becomes really, really foundational, and he fundamentally reinterprets a lot of how Knuckles interprets the situation that he's in, with his father being estranged from his mother, his father having essentially abandoned him at the end of this sort of rite of passage training that he went through to become the guardian of the floating island. In the Ken Penders issues, Knuckles is very concerned with the idea of sort of getting his father back. He's in many ways still very much a boy who's trying to get his father back. But the point of this coming of age idea is that if Knuckles is moving from a sort of a transitionary period of being in his adolescence to being an adult, what Ian Flynn sees in that scenario, in that setup, the premise, is Knuckles would probably feel betrayed by his father, and probably have lingering negative and resentment about his father leaving him, and then deceiving him that he was not actually still alive, and in fact still watching over Knuckles and monitoring his progress as guardian of the floating island, dealing with conflicts with the Dark Legion, dealing with Enerjack coming back. And so what's really going on in this entire situation of the grand sweep of Knuckles as a character, and sort of the half of the world that he really occupies in the Archie comics, is, I think, really emblematic of the entire Sonic comic. I think you can see many parallels in other characters of sort of this idea of the world building around them, but the inner life of the character not really becoming fleshed out until later writers take over, particularly Ian Flynn, mostly Ian Flynn. You see it with Sonic, you see it with Tails, you see it with Sally. Going back to the early issues, it feels very stiff. There's a stiffness and a declarativeness to the writing, or a declarativity to the writing of the way these characters express themselves. They're really conveying information more than they are conveying feelings. And so what's so fascinating about then looking at the early world building is that it's impressive in sort of what it wants to flesh this universe out as being, as sort of a real place. But it isn't until much later in the comics run that it becomes a real place populated with real people. And the fact that it takes that direction, you could arguably say, well, does that mean that the earlier comics are not very good? Well, I think they're actually incredibly vital for this project.